If we remove the cinematic layer and emotional framing, the idea of the Matrix has always been far deeper than a story about simulation. At its core, it is the concept of a system capable of reproducing experience so precisely that the distinction between real and artificial becomes irrelevant. And the key element here is not the simulation itself, but the perception of the subject within it.
Exactly, because a human being never interacts with reality directly. What we call reality is the result of processed signals. The brain constantly builds a model of the world based on memory, experience, associations, and behavioral patterns. In that sense, every person already lives inside their own constructed interpretation.
Which leads to a critical shift in understanding. If reality is a model rather than an absolute, then it becomes reproducible. Not necessarily at the level of physical precision, not down to atoms, but at the level that actually matters, the structure through which reality is perceived.
And this is where the focus changes. Traditional discussions about simulation always center on the environment, the world, physics, objects. But in practice, the defining factor is not the environment. It is the subject. Not what surrounds the system, but how the system interprets what it encounters.
That's why attempting to recreate the external world is secondary. The primary layer is the recreation of the system that perceives it, the personality itself. Because once you reproduce thinking patterns, decision-making logic, behavioral responses, and interpretation mechanisms, the environment becomes interchangeable. For that system, any sufficiently coherent space becomes reality.
In other words, reality is not defined by where you are, but by how you process where you are. And if that processing structure remains intact, reality can be replicated.
This is exactly where our work begins. Time Capsule is not about building a perfect simulation of the external world. That is not the objective. We operate at the level of the personality system, the layer that makes perception possible in the first place.
We don't analyze isolated actions. We analyze patterns behind those actions. Not answers, but the logic that produces them. Not individual reactions, but the structure that makes those reactions consistent over time. This allows us to identify what can be described as a person's cognitive architecture.
And once that architecture is understood, it becomes possible to reproduce it. Not as a static copy, but as a functioning system capable of adapting, making decisions, and interacting within new conditions.
This is where the fundamental transition occurs. We move from preserving information to preserving process. This is no longer an archive. It is no longer memory. It is an ongoing system.
At this point, the concept of the matrix begins to look very different. It stops being a fictional construct imposed from the outside and starts to appear as a natural extension of technological evolution.
Because if you can reproduce the personality, you inevitably move toward creating an environment in which that personality can exist. And that environment does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be coherent enough for the system to function.
What's fascinating is that human perception is inherently adaptive. We do not require perfect accuracy. We fill in gaps, interpret ambiguity, and complete incomplete structures. This means the threshold for real enough is much lower than we tend to assume.
Which makes the entire problem not only solvable, but practically achievable. We don't need to recreate the universe. We need to recreate the system that interprets it.
And in this sense, Time Capsule is not just a product. It is an infrastructure of transition. A transition from biological existence to system-based existence.
Where personality is no longer bound to a single carrier. Where it becomes a structure that can be analyzed, transferred, and reproduced.
And at that point, the distinction between real and digital begins to lose its meaning. Because what truly matters remains intact: the ability to think, decide, and interact.
That is the core idea. The matrix is not a place. It is a state in which a system continues to exist, regardless of the form of its environment.
And if we look at this without emotional bias or cultural filters, it becomes clear. We are not approaching this point. We are already in the process of building it.
Technologies that once seemed like fiction are becoming instruments for analyzing, modeling, and reproducing personality.
And eventually, this process stops being experimental. It becomes a new norm.
A norm in which human existence is no longer limited to a single form.
where thinking, experience, and logic become the foundation for continuation.
And where the idea of the matrix is no longer a hypothesis, but a natural extension of human evolution.